I'm Kurt Bendler. You may know me from other videos such as the one right before this one and War, Usually a Terrible Idea. Today we're going to talk about the last 1,000 years of church history. Our siblings in faith from the Presbyterian tradition have this great phrase, Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformata, which means the church reformed and always reforming. In the last video, we talked about the first 1,000 years of church history and how it was spent mainly figuring out what the church wanted to be. The second 1,000 years have been spent making course corrections to remain who we want to be in the context of a constantly changing world. If you remember from the last video, the monastic movement arose when some Christians decided that the church was getting too cozy with the Roman Empire. 400 years later, the monastics found themselves moving toward Reformation themselves. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, a primary influencer of this group, chose to adhere to a strict understanding of the Benedictine order. What happened was world-changing. They improved water-powered mills. They became one of the leading iron producers in Europe. They became experts in animal breeding. They upset the economic system so much that a middle class emerged. And then they spread it all over Europe. Ever wonder where colleges and universities came from? Around this time, the church decided it needed to formally educate their clergy. The first universities started in cathedrals, but then grew into their own independent institutions with widening scopes of education to include law and early medicine. So far, the church has created some amazing, lasting changes in the world. But you know what else they made that wasn't so great? War. In the late 11th century, the Muslim leaders in the East stopped allowing Christian pilgrims from traveling to the Holy Lands. So the church decided to go to war, launching 5 crusades. Christian control of the Holy Lands only lasted about 200 years, and countless people were killed in these endeavors, just for it to go back to Muslim control. Not our finest hour. In the late 12th century, the church said, you know what would pair nicely with this holy war? An inquisition. Inquisitions were meant to find and eliminate heretics and other enemies of the church. The first group the church hunted and killed were heretics, specifically Gnostics and dualists. Heretics have always been a problem for the church, but killing them? That's not how Jesus do. The second group that were the focus of inquisitions were what history now calls proto-Protestants. Proto-Protestants critiqued the church, like what it meant to live out the gospel, how to worship, and how we know what we know about God. In short, they wanted to make the church better. The second group that were the focus of inquisitions were what history now calls proto-Protestants. They were considered heretics for different reasons. Proto-Protestants critiqued the church, like what it means to live out the gospel, how to worship, and how we know what we know about God. In short, they wanted to make the church better. They wanted the church to be what Jesus meant it to be. The third group the Inquisition went after were the Jews, because, of course, they did. A lot of people were persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and killed during the Inquisitions. But then came the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. For the most part, we stopped, or at least slowed down, killing people we didn't like. Except during this time, the church was probably the most corrupt it had ever been. The Pope was straight up a secular ruler. Rich families bought powerful church positions. If you had a family member in church leadership, you had it made. However, during the Renaissance, the church commissioned some of the most famous works of Christian art through great artists such as Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and probably some other Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue to the Americas, it began a huge colonization effort led by Spain and Portugal. Like the good Christian people they were, the first colonizers used violence to forcibly convert the indigenous people to Christianity, and those who would not convert, they would enslave. Since it had been a minute since Jesus and the early church, white Europeans had forgotten that Jesus and his disciples were all brown people. So when they saw the dark-complected indigenous people in the Americas, they actually had a debate over whether these people had souls or not. At the time, a Christian couldn't own a slave that was also a Christian. So if indigenous people had no souls, then they couldn't be Christians, so you could own them as slaves. The Pope said, yes, they do have souls, much to the chagrin of awful people who also wanted to own other human beings. Sadly, that didn't stop a lot of people because, well, they were on the other side of the planet. What are they going to do to them? Fire them? Not much changed in the church until 2 things happened. The printing press became mainstream, and the Protestant reformers. The arguments of the proto-Protestants hadn't gone away. They had just been greatly suppressed. If you wanted to make an idea go away, you killed the people with those ideas to stop it from spreading. Pretty simple, right? But if you could mass produce those ideas in writing, they say nothing put on the internet ever goes away. But it turns out that the mass-printed ideas are nearly as hard to make disappear. In Germany, Martin Luther, a German priest, had some major beef with the church. He nailed his 95 Theses to the door of his local church, which was how social media worked back in the day. His theses criticized the corruption of the church and offered ideas for reforms. So naturally, he was put on trial, declared a heretic, and it became illegal to give him food or shelter, and made it legal to hunt and kill him. It also made it illegal to follow his teachings. Luther formed the evangelical church in Germany that has grown into what we now know as the Lutheran Church. Around the same time, John Calvin and Huldrych, that's a good baby name, Huldrych Zwingli, began the Swiss Reformed movement, which was focused on the assertion that God was in control of everything. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VIII, wanted an annulment of his marriage, but he was denied by the Pope. So in response, Henry said, "You're not the boss of me," and declared himself the head of the Church of England. The new church considered itself both Reformed and Catholic, just not Roman. The Roman Catholics that did not switch their allegiance to the Church of England suffered persecution. The Roman Catholic Church finally cracked down on things like selling of clergy positions or taking money for the forgiveness of sins. But then, science. In 1610, Galileo made claims that by using his telescope, he was able to determine that, contrary to what the poetry of the Bible said, the earth was not the center of the universe. He was charged with grave suspicion of heresy and was confined to the house arrest for the last 9 years of his life. In England, a group of Christians called Puritans didn't think the Church of England had taken the Reformation far enough and said it was still too Roman for their taste. They said, "We don't like your state-sponsored religion, so we're going to go across the Atlantic Ocean so we can create our own state religion." Hooray, Thanksgiving! In the mid-18th century, another wave of reform occurred that we now call the First Great Awakening. And it happened mainly in the British colonies in North America. John Wesley was part of these reforms, and from it emerged Methodism. Around the end of the 18th century, a Second Great Awakening happened in the U.S. that led to a surge in evangelism and revivals. During the Third Great Awakening, the horrible idea of restorationism emerged. The idea was that the church had gone irredeemably awry shortly after the book of Acts in the first century. Restorationists said, the last 1,600 years of church history, garbage, and none of them were probably real Christians anyway. So restorationist churches strove to return to a so-called biblical model of the church. The problem with many of these restorationalists is that they also ignored all the good things that the church had done since the first century, and thus repeated many of the mistakes and heresies that had been resolved by the church. Movements like Jehovah's Witness and Church of Latter-day Saints ended up with doctrines that deny the fullness of Jesus' divinity, which wouldn't have happened if they had acknowledged the work of the ecumenical councils. The largest conflict that frames the church today began in the late 18th century. As our understanding of the world grew through modern science, many Christians started to try reconciling these new discoveries with the traditions of the church. This was called liberal theology. In reaction, fundamentalism emerged in the late 19th century. Fundamentalists believed that liberal theology rejected Jesus' divine nature, the virgin birth, resurrection, and everything else in the Bible that didn't have a rational or scientific explanation. To be fair, there were some liberal theologians that believed this way. However, there are quite a few that did not. The primary concern of the fundamentalists was with this notion of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible was perfect and without flaw. If you want to know more about that, I talk about it in the video about denominations. Now, I'm going to shift to one of the darkest parts of Christian history. Now, during World War II, the Nazi Party attempted to combine all Protestant churches into one state-sponsored church that combined the racist ideology of the Nazis with Christian theology. Unfortunately, a lot of the hatred of the Jews and Catholics was developed from the anti-Semitic ideology and anti-Catholic writings of Martin Luther. This led to not just Jews, but many Catholics being sent to concentration camps and killed. During the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, the Roman Catholic Church was responsible for hiding and saving more Jews than any other group. Fortunately, not all German Christians went along with the Nazis co-opting the German church. For example, a Lutheran pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a leader in a group that conspired to assassinate Hitler. Sadly, they were unsuccessful in assassinating Hitler, but Bonhoeffer's work and writings have shaped the conversation of most of modern Christian ethics, particularly concerning just war theology. Now, I believe that self-examination as the church and reforming the church is one of the ways we're called to love God and to love our neighbors. It's our job as the church to hold the tension between the truth of who Jesus is and what he has done for creation, and to be constantly examining and reforming how the church operates in the world. We have to constantly ask ourselves hard questions. Does the church structure support the mission of Jesus? Does the church give its allegiance to Jesus, or does it give it to the state? And what does that look like? Should the church use power and coercion to get what it wants? Does Jesus want us to treat people differently because of our perceived differences? Are we focused on the things on which Jesus wants us to focus? Are we loving each other as Jesus loves us? The church is reformed and is always reforming. Keep reforming it, my friends.